Today is early January 30th, 2023. I want to talk about ongoing Russian military operations in and around Ukraine. I want to start by taking a look at the situation on the ground. I'm going to use liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. Keep that in mind when we're looking at it. If we zoom in, the situation in Kherson is stable because Russia's western flank is protected by the Dnieper River. It's a formidable natural defense line across Zaporozhye. There's fighting reported in the direction toward Vuhledar, and this pro-Ukrainian map actually admits that Russia has made progress right to the edge of Vuhledar. And if we look at the situation in and around Bakhmut, we see that the encirclement continues to form. It is a very slow and incremental process. We see these red rifle icons outside of Russian-controlled territory indicated by red. That means that the Russian forces are pushing in this direction. You can see that is a significant road in that direction. These are the lines of communication of Bakhmut being cut off. And before Russia physically controls these roads and railways, they can put them under fire control, which means they can hit them with direct and indirect fire and interdict forces and supplies moving along them. We see likewise fighting around Krasna Gora. Again, you see these road and rail junctions here, very important for moving men and material in and out, and to reinforce other places along this line. And just keep in mind, Bakhmut, Soledar, Seversk, Avdiivka, outside of Donetsk city. This is the last main defense line that Ukraine has in the east. And if a hole gets punched through this defense line anywhere, it's going to compromise the strength and structure of the entire defense network. Here, this liveuamap.com pro-Ukrainian map admits that Blagodetne has been taken as well by Russian forces. And then we see fighting north of Soledar in the direction towards Seversk. We see fighting moving westward between the line of contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces. And that continues all the way along the line of contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces in Kharkov and Lugansk. Now, I had a viewer send me a link to this video here. These are two pro-Ukrainian Westerners. This is the host of the show. He runs a channel, Willie OAM, and this video is titled Untold Reality of Wagner Group in Bakhmut, Ukraine First-Hand Account, What the Media Won't Tell You. And his guest is anonymous. He's a Westerner, I do believe, with the Australian military background. I mean, if you are in the military and you hear this guy talking, he obviously was in the military somewhere. And he's talking about his time and experience in Ukraine, and specifically around Bakhmut, where he is still volunteering. He's saying that he's training and advising Ukrainian forces. He's trying to essentially reverse the situation on the ground that he describes throughout this entire video, and it is pretty bleak. And the host of the show and even the guest kind of gravitate toward these Western narratives that we have spent so much time dispelling. But overall, there is a grappling with reality. So this anonymous guest, these are the sort of things that he admits. He admits that Ukraine is overall losing the war. It's a war of attrition. Russia is definitely killing more Ukrainians than they're losing. They kind of defer to these fake numbers that I've gone over many times, this 100,000 plus number. It's not even close to that. No one has ever broken those numbers down logically. It makes no sense how they're so badly outfighting Ukraine, outgunning them, but still somehow losing as many troops. That makes no sense, and I've never heard anyone explain logically how that would be possible. He talks about Kherson, the Kherson offensive, and how that was essentially a failure because even though they took this territory, they took huge losses doing it, and the Russian military withdrew with all of its forces intact. If you're fighting an attritional war, that is failure. He talks about Kharkov and how Ukraine basically pushed into an area where there was a very small Russian presence. As soon as this Ukrainian force ran into a larger number of Russian troops, the offensive ended, and it has been ended for weeks and months now. He talks about Wagner and how it's completely outfighting Ukrainian forces in and around Bakhmut. Talks about how Wagner has some of the best equipment any army in the world could possibly have. They're well trained, they're well organized, they're well commanded. This is all contrary to claims we've heard in the Western media now. He says there are fresh conscripts, there are convicts taken out of prison. Some of these newer, I would say, untrained troops are sent in. But even in that case, they take far fewer losses than Ukrainian troops do. And he puts it down to the overall organizational structure of Wagner, its leadership, and the equipment that they have. And they enjoy a significant advantage over Ukraine in terms of equipment. So these are all things that he's saying. He's saying that they're encircling Bakhmut, they're cutting off the main supply routes. They start talking about possible solutions to try to change the tide on the ground, so to speak. They talk about these tanks being sent, and he says that it's a secret acknowledgement that things aren't going well for Ukraine, obviously. He's talking about Ukraine. They go back and forth kind of on the tank issue about they should send 200, but then they kind of acknowledge that training Ukraine to use these effectively is not realistic at all. And then eventually he gets to the point where he's talking about how utterly corrupt the Ukrainian government is, how utterly corrupt the military leadership is, how poor the leadership is on the battlefield. He talks about how the Ukrainian troops, they need Western advisors to come in and at least check the worst impulses of these Ukrainian officers, if not lead the units themselves. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but it seems like that's what he would like to see. And this reminds me of something that Alexander Mikuras of the Duran has said many times, comparing the situation in Ukraine to the situation in Vietnam, where the US was backing this corrupt, incompetent regime in southern Vietnam, and how the US military was on the ground as advisors, kind of overseeing everything, and eventually they ended up fighting the war themselves because the Vietnamese in the South were not interested or not able to. This anonymous guest on this in this video talks about a total capability overmatch in favor of Russia in Bakhmut. And so the idea of bringing in Western advisors to try to rectify this, I just think is unrealistic. When you're in the military, as this man most certainly has been, and he definitely knows his stuff in terms of tactics and on the ground, but in terms of overall strategy and geopolitics, no. Okay, so you bring in these Western advisors, or you just have Western officers command these Ukrainian units. You still have all of the problems in terms of logistics, in terms of equipment coming in and disappearing. And so you're going to have these Western advisors and officers demanding that gets fixed. So then you're going to have to bring in American and European officers and advisors to run the entire supply chain. And then before you know it, you're fighting the war against Russia yourself. So there you have it, two pro-Ukrainian Westerners. The host, I don't know what his military experience might be, or if he even has any, but he claims that he has been in Ukraine volunteering to help. The guest obviously had military experience and is in Ukraine giving military advice and providing military training. And they are saying how bleak the situation is in Ukraine overall and around Bakhmut specifically. So let's talk about these tanks. We're hearing about tanks. We're hearing a lot of talk like we said we weren't going to send tanks. Now we're sending tanks. We said we weren't going to send ATACMS. We probably will. We'll probably also send warplanes. They'll probably send everything, but ultimately it doesn't matter. So why are they talking about this? If it's going to take years for an army under the most ideal conditions to incorporate all of this equipment into their military, train personnel to use it effectively on the battlefield, Ukraine cannot do this in the middle of a war. It is impossible. So why are they doing this? We see articles like this from CNN. Ukraine's new tanks won't be the instant game changer some expect. We see this from the New York Times. Tanks alone won't turn the tide of the war in Ukraine. And both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikhouris of the Duran, they've both covered this article and articles like it in the past couple of days. So why are we sending these weapons? Why are we talking about tanks and ATACMS and even warplanes that have no possibility of realistically helping Ukraine in any way? Number one, it is for a lack of a better alternative. They don't know what else to do. Their only other alternative is to just leave Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield with small arms and no support. Number two, I'm starting to see evidence that seems to suggest that the US is just trying to bluff Russia. They understand the situation that they're in, and they feel that if they just commit as many weapons as possible, as much support as possible to Ukraine, they can force Moscow to kind of question their confidence regarding their own plans in terms of Ukraine and the outcome of this conflict. Now, I want to go to this. This is the RAND Corporation extending Russia. This is from 2019. I've talked about this many times before. I want to point out things that it has said. It says, this report examines Russia's economic, political, and military vulnerabilities and anxieties. It then analyzes potential policy options to exploit them ideologically, economically, geopolitically, and militarily, including air and space, maritime, land, and multi-domain options. So essentially, how can we threaten Russia and force them to react in a way that overextends them militarily, economically, politically, across all of these domains? And then they talk about these measures that they will use to do this. And listen to each measure, and surely you will realize that the US has been doing all of this before, during, and after this report was written. Measure one, these are economic measures. Measure one, hinder petroleum exports. Measure two, reduce natural gas exports and hinder pipeline expansion. So, I mean, the US literally blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. That's how far they've gone to implement measure number two. And measure three, impose sanctions. They have committed to this to the absolute extreme. There really are no more sanctions that the US and their allies can put on Russia. And then measure four, enhance the Russian brain drain. And just remember, if Russia or China articulated a similar policy but toward the United States, and then they began implementing each measure, this would be perceived as a national security threat, even an act of war. And I don't think the US would have tolerated it for even a moment. There are also geopolitical measures. Measure one, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This is what the US has been doing since 2014. Measure two, increase support to the Syrian rebels. And by rebels, they mean Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who the Russian Federation has been fighting in Syria since 2015. Measure three, promote regime change in Belarus. This is something the US was openly doing in 2020, so just a year after this paper was published. Measure four, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. It must just be a coincidence that they wrote this in the RAND Corporation paper, and then war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus region. Measure five, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. We remember the US-sponsored regime change operation in Kazakhstan in early 2022, right before the Russian special military operation began. And measure six, challenge Russian presence in Moldova. So this was a former Soviet republic, and Russian forces are still there because of circumstances have led to that, and the US wants to evict them. And again, imagine if this was reversed, if Russia was challenging the US in North America like this, along America's own borders. So you can see how the US wasn't just competing with Russia, they were threatening Russia, they were provoking Russia, they were implementing measures that were killing Russian troops, and not just killing Russian troops, but killing troops and even civilians in nations that were allied to Russia. The US was creating multiple existential threats for Russia to deal with, knowing that eventually Russia would have to respond. And they knew that when Russia responded, it would tax them heavily in terms of economics, military, having to go into Ukraine, knowing that it will be subjected to sanctions, knowing that this would cut into their economy. This was the plan from the very beginning. But the paper also warned specifically about arming Ukraine and turning Ukraine into a flashpoint. It says, alternatively, Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine. Russia might even preempt U.S. action, escalating before any additional U.S. aid arrives. Such escalation might extend Russia. Eastern Ukraine is already a drain. Taking more of Ukraine might only increase the burden, albeit at the expense of the Ukrainian people. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to U.S. prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead to Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. So this is what Rand Corporation warned about in 2019. You can do this, it'll extend Russia, but these are the consequences. That brings us to exactly where we are right now. And now we see the US and their allies trying to do everything within their power to mitigate the impact of this fallout that they were warned about back in 2019. So now we come to this new Rand Corporation paper, 2023, Avoiding a Long War, U.S. Policy and the Trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. Now, the Duran, both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris went over this paper extensively. I will put the links to their videos in the video description below. But I just want to add a few things here. It says, a protracted conflict, as perverse as it might seem, has some potential upsides for the United States. While the war continues, Russian forces will remain preoccupied with Ukraine and thus not have the bandwidth to menace others. A longer war would further degrade the Russian military and weaken the Russian economy. Alexander Mikuris has pointed out that from his perspective, and I think many people objectively looking at this, they don't see it that way. It also says it will take years, perhaps even decades, for the Russian military and economy to recover from the damage already incurred. Again, based on what facts? But if you're listening to all of these benefits, these all dovetail perfectly with the previous 2019 Rand Corporation paper. All of the things they said they wanted to achieve, this conflict now allows them to achieve a lot of these objectives. It also says a long war would also maintain pressure on European governments to continue to reduce energy dependence on Russia and spend more on their defense, possibly lessening the U.S. defense burden in Europe over the long run. The longer this goes on, the more pressure the West puts on Russia over this conflict, the easier it is to force European countries to cut off any sort of imports in terms of energy from Russia. So where are they buying it from? The United States. When they have to increase defense spending, who are they buying weapons from? The United States. These are the corporations, big oil and the arms industry, that fund Rand Corporation's policy recommendations. Just keep that in mind. But then the paper warns about the downsides. It says continued conflict also leaves open the possibility that Russia will reverse Ukrainian battlefield gains made in fall of 2022. Moscow's mobilization might stabilize the lines as of December 2022 and allow Russia to launch offensives in 2023. The intensity of the military assistance effort could also become unsustainable after a certain period. Already, European and some U.S. stocks of weapons are reportedly running low. There is thus reason to question whether a longer war will lead to further Ukrainian gains. Losses are possible too. The costs for the United States and the European Union for keeping the Ukrainian state economically solvent will multiply over time as conflict inhibits investment and production. Ukrainian refugees remain unable to return, and as a result, tax revenue and economic activity drop dramatically lower than before the war. Russia's campaign of destruction of Ukraine's critical infrastructure will create major long-term challenges for sustaining the war effort and for economic recovery, and has also substantially increased Kiev's projections for the economic support it will need from the United States and its allies. It also says the outbreak of war caused a sharp increase in energy prices that has in turn contributed to inflation and slowing economic growth globally. These trends are expected to hit Europe hardest. The increase in energy prices alone is likely to lead to nearly 150,000 excess deaths in Europe in the winter of 2022-2023. You notice how most of these costs are going to be paid by Ukraine and Europe and not the United States. And some people might ask, why is Europe going along with this then? Because just like the US has captured Ukraine politically and installed a client regime in Kiev that answers to Washington, they have also done this all across Europe, in the individual governments of European countries and across the entire bureaucracy of the European Union. But the actual most important part of this paper, I think, or at least the part I want to focus on here, is this. It says, if a clear long-term plan were adopted with credible delivery schedules and clear capability implications, they're talking about weapons, it could make Russia more pessimistic about the future of its own campaign. The United States has already taken steps in this direction with the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative and the establishment of a component of the U.S. European command dedicated to the Ukraine assistance effort. But arms deliveries have not yet become regular, nor is there a transparent long-term plan. Western assistance continues to be calibrated in response to Russian actions, and thus Ukraine's future capabilities are uncertain. In other words, what they're talking about is bluffing Russia, sending in so many weapons, pledging so much support, attempting to make it seem as if the support is endless and thus no end in sight for Russia, and then make Russia second guess its commitment to this conflict that is very clearly transforming into a long war. It is the United States trying to bluff Russia into believing that it is more committed over the long term than Russia ever will be. The one really great thing, though, about this bluff, whether it works or not, this means a huge windfall for all of the sponsors that fund everything that the RAND Corporation does, these arms manufacturers in particular. And this kind of reminds me of Afghanistan. And if you read all of the programs the U.S. was investing in terms of Afghanistan, you would have thought for sure Afghanistan would eventually be transformed into like the 51st state of the United States. That was how extensive these programs were. But the problem was these contractors didn't actually care about implementing any of these programs, any of these projects. They just wanted their money and they wanted to go home and spend it. And the same goes for Ukraine. They have no interest in building up Ukraine. They want to make their money and then they want to go home. They don't care if the project works or not. We go back to that video where you had these two pro-Ukrainian Westerners complaining about all, if you watch that whole interview, they talk about all of these aid groups getting millions of dollars of donations and how they go into Ukraine and they're very obviously pocketing the vast majority of that money, and they're giving these token amounts of equipment to Ukrainians that makes absolutely no difference at all on the battlefield. They are their own worst enemy. If Russia is confident in its military-industrial output, if it is confident in its socio-political cohesion, if it is confident in its economic stability, understanding that Ukraine is going to have difficulty incorporating all of this support that is flooding Ukraine solely to panic Russian policymakers, if they are confident, they're going to stick to this. They will find the resolve and they will continue with this special military operation. They will deal with these tanks when they come and destroy them, just as they have all of these other tanks. that NATO has sent and Russia has destroyed, which is why NATO is sending more tanks in the first place. They will be able to adapt to and deal with these ATACMS when they are sent, and they will be able to shoot down all of these F-16s they're talking about sending because, again, Ukraine had an air force when this all started. Russia destroyed it on the ground and shot it out of the air. What do you think is going to happen to F-16s? The West is going to continue, though, pledging all of this support. Think about it, though, how they pledged the M1 Abrams. Now they're saying it might take up to a year or more to actually send the Leopards first, get them burning on the battlefield first, and we'll just keep kicking the can down the road. Hopefully we won't even have to send M1 Abrams and watch them also burn in Ukraine. You can almost see how artificial this commitment is to Ukraine, and you could almost sense the bluff that they're trying to use against Russia. So we'll just have to keep an eye on this. I mean, this is a working theory. As more evidence emerges, we'll have to come back and re-examine this. What is the Rand Corporation, these policymakers, what are they really up to? What is Washington really up to? But at the end of the day, we're hearing from people on the ground, pro-Ukrainian Westerners, about how bleak the situation is for Ukraine. They are skeptical that tanks are going to make any difference. We have generals, US generals with experience commanding tank units, saying how unrealistic it is to send these tanks and how unrealistic it is to expect any difference. We have articles from across the Western media skeptical about the game-changing ability of these tanks. And just remember, we were already told that the HIMARS and the M777 changed the game. Why do we need to change the game again? Because this process of sending Ukraine equipment they're unfamiliar with does not work. It didn't work with the HIMARS and the M777s. It's not going to work with tanks, ATACMS, and F-16s. That does it for this video. If you thought it was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as for all of the links that I referenced while making this video, including that interview between those two pro-Ukrainian Westerners. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If you ever see ads pop up on YouTube, please feel free to skip or block them. They don't help me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what allows me to do this work. And even if you're just helping share my work with others, I greatly appreciate that. And as always, thank you for watching.